It's really wonderful to have Freddie Wyman here from Survival International. Those of you, anyone in this area knows Survival is probably the oldest group anywhere to be fighting for the rights of indigenous peoples. And its director, Stephen Corey, has a long tradition of arguing that empowering groups for self-determination is significantly more meaningful than prepping them for the global economy, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think in a way that Stephen has, and the organization has been really consistent in doing this, and very admirably so. So I'm going to hand right over to Freddie, who's going to talk about that's what we're doing. Conservation of biodiversity and access to, of the Abaka in Cameroon to environmental justice. Freddie, thanks for being with us.
Okay, well, thanks for the very kind introduction. And thanks too for Arati for inviting me to speak about environmental justice and the Abaka of Cameroon on behalf of Survival. I feel I should start with by offering a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, but I hope I can present enough material for an interesting discussion afterwards. And in that spirit, I'll try and keep my bit as short as possible. So essentially, the Abaka have been persecuted by by anti-poaching squads in Cameroon since at least 2001. And this has been publicly documented for at least as long. They're being forced from their ancestral lands and are the routine target of violence and intimidation at the hands of these squads. And these squads are employed by the Cameroonian government, but they rely on funding and support from international organizations like WWF, Zoological Society London, and the German Development Ministry, and IUCN, the big four. So I'll start by giving some brief background to the Abaka and their recent history, and then I would like to try to talk in a bit more detail about the legal framework of resource management in this part of Cameroon, and then about the general lack of accountability which renders environmental justice nigh on impossible. As we'll see, there are problems with the law itself and with how it is or isn't applied. So here's a map of Cameroon, and for a bit of background, the Abaka, there are between 30 and 60,000 Abaka living mostly in eastern Cameroon, here, also northern Gabon, northern Congo-Brazzaville, and western CAR. For the purposes of this case study, we'll be looking mostly at this southeastern region here, where the Abaka is in fact the only area where the Abaka are a majority, but in fact these problems are by no means confined to this area. So the Abaka are historically hunter-gatherers, and today they divide the year between time spent in the village, or a hamlet or a village on the road. So here we can see the main roads here, where they tend to their crops and gardens, live usually with neighbouring groups, and make shorter trips into the nearby forest for hunting, and time spent in the deeper forest. So for example, our winter time is their long dry season, and many Abaka say that their skin doesn't react well to the harsh sunlight. So during this period, families take to the forest for fishing trips of a few weeks to a few months, moving from camp to camp in the forest. But it's worth emphasizing that the forest is critically important for the Abaka all year round, for things like collecting forest medicines, to escape problems in these villages on the road, such as conflicts with their neighbors or epidemics in the village, and as well as for shorter hunting trips. So since the late 1990s, most of the Abaka's ancestral land in this area has been designated, without their consent, as protected areas. And in this case, like in the heyday of African colonialism, protected areas means either national parks, which are here in green, 3 national parks in Key, Bumbabek, and Lebeke, and hunting zones. And here that's in the orange hatching all over here. And for almost all of these hunting zones are geared towards wealthy foreign hunting interests. So safari hunters who pay 5,000 euros and hunt a forest elephant. And here the brown zones are logging concessions.
Wow.
So the Baka are, on paper at least, permitted to do certain types of hunting and gathering in certain parts of these areas, but not really enough to survive. And more to the point, even these small allowances are often not respected by these anti-poaching squads that these international organizations support. So the Baka face arrest, beatings, and even torture at the hands of these squads. When they come across a Baka camp in the forest, they often burn it to the ground and seize or destroy the belongings they find. These squads often also arrive in the villages and torture Baka and their neighbours in order to obtain information about poaching. And many say that relatives and friends have died as a result of their beatings.
So who's being, could you repeat that? They're being tortured by?
By these anti-poaching squads.
Okay.
So that's primarily what are called eco guards, or wildlife officers, as well as soldiers, which occasionally accompany them on their patrols, and police officers, so the forces of law and order. So the Baka are being forced from the forest in this way, and many say that their health is plummeting as a result. There are more diseases in the village, from malaria to HIV/AIDS. People have lost access to forest medicines. They say they're more reliant on less nutritional food in the village. Women say they can no longer recover as well after childbirth. They can no longer take their children into the forest when there's an outbreak of disease in the village, as they would in the recent past. And there's a host of other problems, from prostitution to alcoholism is a real problem, and just communities being broken apart. I don't think it's overstating the case at all to call this a real humanitarian disaster that's happening in Cameroon. So here, I would like to show a clip of a few Baka speaking in July and August of this year about the abuses they've suffered at the hands of these squads and their thoughts on conservation in general.
Ngane brime de galishas. Monde e anda Bakoto Koto Joapele Matoto Nopuman Belly Galishas Masidi chauffeur en Belly Boke Masidi a raclé nous les bim maté etebe to côté nous monter bidé ma obligé de monter konole agbole mo bele atondange mo do agboe ende e akpe mo agba awasu ana kambia wo agbola awani na kambia ma yayi kwa pe maje ocheche maje sikindi
dobi nga ye kina na bitike ode kanon de baka ba yo bongo na dobi na kabaka ba jo pata na dobi ne kokolo bela ko adona moto atolo ke mu eko ngbe ke safari me bongo wo joko luana safari na mobode bela ko no wo ko bide ko safari dobi wa motolo wo joko de tendele na dobi na safari amwa moko ko abele buke momobo amo tendele boke anyibe ekoto ebubane amwa moko abele amomo mo ko to fa so ale oh ka kembi atendele na eyebe bo wo gwajo eode abele ne.
Dès qu'ils sont derrière les moyens, ils viennent maintenant taper sur les gens avec la machette. Il fait déshabiller quelqu'un. La personne est nue, même pas l'habit. On lui met comme ça à genoux, on lui tape avec la machette et prend de l'eau, verser sur la personne là. Même quelqu'un, l'enfant, on lui verse l'eau sur ces gens-là. Maintenant, ce qui était avant, ceux qui on les a tapés là, ils n'ont plus ici. Ils ont déjà mouru avec la douleur de ces machettes qu'ils les tapaient avec. Tout le monde, les autres sont déménagés pour aller au Congo. Ils ne sont plus ici. Ils ont déjà peur de ces problèmes, les problèmes des bières et les GFA là.
Menga ma yefe pili ma no apili ma no wa ya la apili ma jo fo ya la apili ma to keke la apili jona mo kiri ko fe tu ma yefe ma jo pour que ma jo et na bele so ma jo so bien égal ma do bien ma no santé bien bele ma ye et tout ma jo ya bele ma jongwi ye ko e keke go for ki safa suma ye ko ndenge jo tandu go njenje poli na kaku jo ke no abele tout ma jo tout go donc ma ye bele et tout livre tout le monde il no abele.
So, as it said in that text at the end of the film, one of the saddest aspects of all this is that the Baka really are best conservationists. And in some ways this is obvious. The reason why their forests were so attractive to conservationists in the first place is because they cared for them for so well, for so long, they and their neighbours. And they're often called the eyes and ears of the forest. You know, they know their lands back to front and everything that happens on it, far more than the anti-poaching squads do or these international organizations. They know when poachers enter the forest, but at the moment there's little to nothing they can do. And studies have shown that the Baka's forest way of life actually improves the habitat for various animals in different ways. So for example, they spread pockets of wild yams through the forest, which are the favorite foods of elephants and bush pigs. And when they clear vegetation to make a forest camp, this then turns into the kind of secondary forest which gorillas prefer. And one study commissioned by WWF found that Baka hunting codes forbid the harming of female animals and forbid the overhunting of a particular area, which is why Baka moved from camp to camp in the forest. And sharing and equality are a really central part of Baka philosophy, both with other people in the camp and with the environment. So if, for example, you take too much meat from the forest on one day, that will damage your success at hunting in the future. So the Baka have developed really sophisticated codes of conservation, but despite this, they're still not being supported enough by conservationists like WWF. And sadly, many Baka say that because they are now afraid to take their children into the forest or to spend long there, they're unable to pass on these values and skills to the next generation. So now I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about the ambiguous and problematic legal framework of resource management in this part of Cameroon that is one part of the problem. So according to hunting regulations that were introduced in the mid-1990s, Baka are allowed to hunt traditionally in all forests apart from protected areas. So here you can see that protected areas are almost all of their lands. Within protected areas, they can be re-granted hunting rights, but only in management plans and agreements like that. And often this rarely happens. But also, as you can see, there is a huge overlapping of competing land use in the area. So here, for example, this logging concession overlaps with a safari hunting concession, which itself overlaps with a national park. And when provisions are made for the Baka, these sometimes are not respected by other land users. So this national legislation violates the Baka's rights according to international instruments like ILO Convention 169 and the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it's also in breach of the Convention on Biodiversity, according to which states must protect customary use of resources in accordance with traditional cultural practices that are compatible with conservation requirements. And according to the Cameroonian Constitution, ratified international agreements like the Convention on Biodiversity, in fact, take precedence over national legislation. But this idea of traditional hunting and customary use, in fact, raises an important question which is really central to the idea of custodial rights, and that is who determines what is and is not traditional. In Cameroon, traditional hunting means hunting for subsistence using plant materials. So in theory, if a Baka hunts with an iron-tipped spear, or if he trades part of his catch for salt or for soap or for school books, kerosene, this could then be considered poaching. And in fact, Baka have depended on metal snares for trapping for 40 years or more, so well before these hunting regulations were introduced in the 90s. However, in the eyes of law enforcers, these snares too are not traditional. But in fact, hunting technologies have always been changing. So, for example, the crossbows that Baka also use, and which are considered traditional, are thought to have been introduced by the Portuguese in the 15th and 16th centuries. As the anthropologist James Woodburn points out, there is an ideological bias that sees effective farming techniques sees more effective farming techniques as more efficient, but more effective hunting techniques as unsustainable. And this is a really common assumption in conservation, that local people can only be allowed to live in or near protected areas if they adhere to traditional practices. And this can amount to what the ecologist Robert Goodland described as forced primitivism, and poses questions about self-determination that are just as pressing as those concerning eviction from protected areas, which is also occurring here. So aside from the ethical problems presented by attaching conditions to rights, these conditions themselves are often poorly thought through. Another thing to think of is exactly what we mean by custodial rights. For instance, a memorandum of understanding between the Baka around one of these parks, Bumbabek, the central park, and the Cameroonian government was drafted and then stalled for lack of funds. And according to this MOU, the Baka would have been allowed to hunt within the park, but in return, they would have been legally obliged to report on any illegal activities they found within the park. And this would have placed them at serious risk. So as we can see, this legal framework requires us to really think hard about what we mean by poaching, since Baka are often criminalized as poachers when they hunt to feed their families, as they have done for generations. And this is a point often missed when we think about the fight against poaching. And in fact, there's also a formal hunting licensing system that's worth mentioning. But again, the law doesn't really accommodate reality. So when Baka hunt with guns, for example, and these are often the kind of artisanal rifles which have been around for about 100 years, they usually borrow the gun from a non-Baka and then share the catch. But Cameroonian hunting regulations effectively require you to register and use your own gun. And so that disadvantages the Baka again. And yet another example of the gap between policy and practice is the various village committees through which local people are supposed to be involved in resource management. So they're meant to receive income from safari, hunting, from conservation, from logging, and in theory, volunteer information about poaching to the authorities. But on the ground, the Baka, who are very marginalized, are more or less completely excluded from these institutions. And even their neighbors who are on these committees complain that agreements are rarely respected. So this brings me to the third thing I wanted to touch on, which is the general lack of oversight and accountability that undermines environmental justice, as well as conservation priorities themselves. So as I said before, Baka say that even these allowances are rarely respected by the anti-poaching squads. So even if the restrictive criteria are met, occasionally legally hunted meat is confiscated and the hunters are punished. And in fact, victims of abuse include people who rarely, if ever, hunt, such as elderly men and women, pregnant women, children, and young teenagers. So one response to survival's work has been to ask to what extent this is a systematic problem rather than a case of a few bad apples or a few black sheep. But in fact, even if it is just a handful of people that are responsible, international organizations like WWF have no system of monitoring or no grievance mechanisms in place so that it becomes a systematic problem. That is to say, a problem with the system. So whilst we're not suggesting that every wildlife officer is guilty of this kind of crimes, it does appear to be an institutional problem. For example, in 2012, a high-ranking official in the ministry that employs the wildlife officers said of suspected poachers that we torture them when they do not want to talk. And WWF was made aware of this. So by pouring funds and support into a repressive environment when there's already evidence of abuse, and without putting measures in place to prevent further abuse, organizations like WWF risk facilitating these crimes. And Baka themselves have very little direct access to justice. When you ask victims whether they've considered making a formal complaint, they say more or less the same thing. They don't have the money to pay for transport to the nearby town. They don't have the money to pay for the fees that police charge to register complaints. And perhaps more fundamentally, their oppressors belong to the forces of law and order. So wildlife officers, soldiers, police. And even if local police are willing to pursue a complaint, they're not seen as such by many Baka. This is the same in other parts of the Congo Basin. I remember speaking to a Mbengele pygmy man, so related to the Baka in Congo, and he recounted an incident of torture, and I asked him whether he considered filing a complaint, and he said, "Who will listen to me? The trees?" So this lack of oversight is not just ruining people's lives, it also leads to poor resource management. So it's terrible for the environment. Since poorly monitored wildlife officers can take bribes from poachers, they can poach themselves, or they can turn a blind eye to the powerful figures, which are often government officials, that organize poaching networks. As one Baka man said to me, anti-poaching squads are letting the elephants die out in the forest at the same time as they're stopping people from eating. And it is true that biodiversity is under serious threat in this part of Cameroon, but current approaches mostly focus on symptoms rather than causes. They fail to tackle the expansion of industrial interests such as logging, mining, and agribusiness, and these have an immediate impact both on the environment and on the Baka. For example, the sapelli, which is a type of tree most often harvested for timber, is an important nesting site for butterflies, a particular kind of butterfly, whose caterpillars are collected by the Baka as food when they fall to the forest floor. But more than this kind of industrial expansion also stimulates demand for poaching and facilitates trafficking networks to larger cities and to abroad. Now I've heard many conservationists say that logging is either inevitable or even desirable as a way of managing forests. And organizations such as the Zoological Society of London and WWF therefore have chosen to partner with logging companies, perhaps in the sense of better the devil you know. But in fact, this industrial expansion is not inevitable, and especially not in its current form, and presenting it as such is profoundly damaging. In the case of Cameroon, for example, the logging boom of the 90s stemmed in no small part from policies made by international financiers like the World Bank. So in response to Cameroon's balance of payments crisis in the late 1980s, these institutions offered a set of grants and commercial rate loans to stimulate logging for export on the one hand and the establishment of protected areas on the other. So if you look at the broader political economy, you can see that what this repressive conservation system and what is effectively the destruction of the environment are part of the same way of thinking and often the same set of policies. So this raises a really important question of what responsibility donors to this conservation system, like WWF, ZSL, German Development Ministry, bear for such crimes. Because it's not just the anti-poaching squads which lack checks and controls. how are these donor organizations answerable to their supposed beneficiaries? Like I said, this persecution has been publicly documented since at least 2001, so it's a very long-standing problem. And complaints have repeatedly been made to WWF about this. And WWF, in fact, is the main partner of the ministry that employs the wildlife officers, and it provides critical support and funding to these squads. They are driven around by WWF drivers in WWF cars that run on WWF fuel, and backers say that they've been tortured in WWF's field bases. So there's a real crisis of accountability, starting with financiers like the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility, then going through implementing agencies and organizations like WWF, and right down to the anti-poaching squads on the ground. And this is what we at Survival are trying to raise awareness of beginning this year. And the idea that this kind of conservation is terrible both for local people and the environment is by no means new. Already 18 years ago, the anthropologist Robert Bailey, who worked with Mbuti pygmies in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, said that local people must come first in Central African forests and they must have formal land tenure. Yet despite an increase in rhetoric of participation, empowerment, sustainable livelihoods, little seems to have changed in terms of mainstream conservation. WWF has drawn up a statement of principles on indigenous peoples and conservation, but it seems that few, if any, of these principles are being applied in southeast Cameroon. And yet there is growing evidence that the environment is better cared for when land is held in common by local people than when it's controlled by states and then rented out to industries. But nevertheless, there is still this inertia on the part of conservation organizations. So I think, 10 days, this decade's World Parks Congress starts in Sydney, and there's one stream of the conference which is called Respecting Indigenous and Traditional Knowledge and Culture. And while this is, of course, crucial to respect these things, I think it's also worth asking why they'll be talking more about knowledge and culture and less about livelihoods and rights. So our position is that organizations like WWF need to stick to international law and uphold indigenous people's land rights. They need to ask them what help they need in defending their lands and be prepared to back them up as much as they can. In Cameroon, this will create better relations between conservationists and tobacco, and also help to train attention on the real drivers of environmental degradation, and therefore lead to a more effective conservation. I think, it's important to emphasize that this is not just tobacco that are affected by this. I mean, the dark side of conservation is playing out throughout the world. So I think I've rambled on for long enough, so maybe we can have some.
Freddie, this is a really compelling presentation, and I'm sure it will lead to discussion throughout lunch and the afternoon for sure. But I want to get back just to kick things off here to your original comment about who determines what is traditional, because we obviously UNESCO, the idea of heritage is being something that can be located in a particular place and among a particular group, and part of the foundation of getting representation is being able to establish what the identity of a group is in the first place. And what I see happening here is a terrific abrogation of the identity of these peoples in conjunction with the fact that there's got to be clearly a lot more naming and shaming. I mean, who owns all these concessions? The world population will double, and if they think this is going to take care of our lumbering needs, our 6.5 million are going to be 11 by the end of the century, if not before. I mean, even this kind of management is not going to sustain the demand on timber. So there's clearly something else has to be done, and those people who tag trees, a friend of mine is involved in that, i.e. shaming people who try to import trees by tagging illegal logging. The question of there being a market for this. I mean, when I see the green, the darker green of what's here held in concessions, I mean, horrible, you know, picture. So I guess my question is, I mean, how does WWF, for example, respond to this naming and shaming, especially if they're working with the management, so-called, of nature in the interest of what they perceive to be the natural world versus the human world?
Yeah. So our exchanges with WWF so far have been dispiriting, I guess, to say the least. So we actually Survival first, raised the question of the expropriation of Baka land in the name of conservation in 1991 with WWF and the Cameroonian government. Our focus on this violence, I guess, and these anti-poaching squads really began this year. And we wrote to WWF first in March and have received quite a few different responses from different parts of the network. Some say that, in fact, Philippe may remind you of this, that our allegations are absurd without giving any reason why. And
So they think you paid these people in this movie, or something?
I don't know, I didn't bother to watch it. And another response is that they haven't had enough information, enough sufficiently grounded allegations to take action. And to my mind, that's missing the point. When they're pouring money into this system, they have the responsibility to make sure that they're always informed about any rumor or reported abuse, and that it's properly investigated and action is taken. It seems that now they've created a position of willful ignorance in a way, where they are left unaware of what's happening in this quite remote area, and then use that to justify doing nothing. But I think, just on the back of a few conversations with them, it seems that they are reluctant. Perhaps they underestimate the influence that they have with the ministry, and they are reluctant to shape the vote. I guess they don't want to jeopardize their own work by pointing out crimes done by government agents.
So the question is, we have to find some way of forcing them into action.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Ewan?
Yes, one theme that regularly comes up with Cameroonian asylum applications, both in this country and in France, is, although I have to say I've never seen a Baka.
Can you hear Ewan in the back? Okay, great.
Well, I must say, all the applications that I see come from further north than the Adamawa, areas of the Adamawa Plateau, and of course from the metropolitan centres of Yaoundé and Douala. But one theme that does emerge, and I regularly talk to Cameroonian support groups and have researched some of the claims, is le pouvoir, the heart of the government and the presidency's connection with the networks trafficking human organs. And it's apparently at the heart of this, it's a very good article on the subject, is sacrificial control of different Cameroonian populations. If they can be sacrificed, they can be, and if their organs can be traded by ministers. The Minister of Health was involved, there are accusations of the Minister of Defence is involved. And I'm wondering if this particular form of violence, you mentioned the region's connections with networks in Metropolis as well. Is that something you've seen at all? Because we have many witnesses to that in the UK.
Trade in body parts.
Trading in body parts and its connection with the presidency and his immediate, Bia's immediate.
The only case that I've heard of, in fact, not in Cameroon, but in Wesso, so on the border here with Congo, where the mayor was involved in a sort of trafficking circuit of women's reproductive parts.
Yes,
and that went on for like a year or two before he was actually found guilty. But in this part of Cameroon, I've never really heard of it. There's a lot of kind of superstitions concerning backup body parts. You know, that if you put a few flakes of skin and their blood inside on your cocoa plantation, it will grow very well. So there is kind of a trade of sorts, but I don't know if it's related to the authorities. But what is related to the authorities is the illegal wildlife trade. And conservationists often present poaching, the fight against poaching, as a matter of national security, international security, and you know they conjure up these images of rebels, very dangerous rebels coming in, the LRA, the Seleka, the Janjaweed, and this is true to some extent. You know, there is organized crime, organised crime does benefit from the illegal wildlife trade, but also it's government officials, public officials, that facilitate this trade, because you can't really have a sustainable poaching business if you haven't already got the support of police, for example, or local ministers, local politicians. And this is used as a way of keeping of rent seeking, I guess.
But what about, I mean, it's easy to identify the companies that own all these logging concessions, or are they front companies? I mean, can you name it?
Well, so here,
You've got them all labeled.
here, this is the Cefac, which is an Italian company. Well, in fact, there's an Italian company called Vastolegno, which is the exclusive broker of the Cefac wood and the timber in these Cefac concessions. And they have the same director, they're represented by the same person in meetings, but in paper they're different entities. But effectively, this is owned by one Italian company. And this is the company that WWF has chosen to partner with to try and help it gain certification. And in fact, it lost certification in 2011, FSC certification, and recently regained it, I think, earlier this year. But for 3 years, it didn't have FSC certification. But on its website, if you visited the Vastolegno website or the Group Cefac website, it had the WWF handle and the FSC tree. So anyone going on those websites would be forgiven for thinking that they were buying very ethical wood, when in fact this is back ancestral land. They're being forced from forest there. And so it seems that WWF, in this case at least, are really compromised. But something I forgot to mention is that as well as the logging boom, we're about to witness a huge mining boom in this region. This Congo-Cameroon border region is one of the richest mineral deposits in Africa, and there's a huge scramble for the mineral wealth here. And in fact, there are 4 iron mines which are being developed in this region, and a railway corridor going from the sea, from Kribi, into this heart of the forest. And so this kind of thing, again, will really spell disaster for the environment, will make poaching even easier. And it seems the response of conservationists has been to buckle down and pour more and more resources into this repressive system that it just isn't working.
So what can be done?
That's actually a good lead on. So I mean, it's incredibly depressing to hear what's going on, and focusing specifically on the violence that you've talked about. Perhaps I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about survival strategies going forward in terms of what Survival wants to do in this respect, and how other organisations and individuals can potentially assist or be involved in that procedure.
So something that we're trying to emphasise is that we don't believe that this problem will be solved by tackling 1 or 2 individual cases. That's important for ending the kind of climate and impunity that there is. But in fact, people need to know that this is a really systematic and long-standing problem. So we, at the moment, are trying to hold these international funders to account, because these are the ones with the policies, people, an NGO, which hopefully we expect better of. And so we're just, at the moment, just trying to raise awareness. But in terms of litigation, like I said, it would be very welcome, but I think it could be quite difficult to find complainants, because DACA are worried for their safety, and for good reason. And there's also quite a general disillusionment with the idea of justice and the idea of changing government. So to my mind, I think cases have been brought to court twice. Once in 2007, when a Baka man was beaten so hard he went blind, and that case dragged on, and then eventually the wildlife officer responsible apparently paid off the authorities, and the case was quashed. And then in 2010, soldiers who were part of a raid, an anti-poaching raid, there, Lokoma, which is marked on the map, raped and killed a non-Baka man, and they were sent to prison, but again, only for, I think, a year.
Correct.
So it seems that litigation is definitely has an important role to play, but also I think public awareness is really key as well.
So you'd rather other people got involved in Survival's awareness raising by direct action advocacy or something like that.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Yeah.
Yes.
So, a comment and a question. I've been working at the Indian Resource Centre in DC, and this summer we were writing a guidebook for conservation, which they'll be presenting at the IUs at the World Parks Conference. A rights-based approach. So, kind of delimiting all of the rights that Indigenous people have, and just to kind of raise, to educate the conservation community. So to see how they can respect them going forward. The question, so for that I was researching a lot of case studies. They've chosen Mesoamerica as an example simply because the countries in Mesoamerica have signed and are party to most of the conventions on Indigenous human rights. So it's a good example. So I was researching Nicaragua and Honduras, and a lot of the situation is similar. In Nicaragua, there's the fossilized biosphere, which is part of the UN man and the biosphere kind of. So they're trying to have it be not just pure conservation, but kind of include humans and communities within that. But kind of ends up coming down to just kind of service consultations that then don't lead to very much, or multiple use areas, so that units of people are kind of bound and confined to using the land in particular ways as well, talking about kind of traditional things. In those cases, the Indigenous groups are pushing for their ideal. They're pushing for title, communal title to their land, so to demarcate and have their lands titled as theirs. So I was just wondering, in this case, is that something that the Baka are pushing for, or what would be their ideal kind of solution to it?
That's a really good question. I think it would take a long time to talk about properly. Right, so in terms of land titles, this, going back to what Clive was saying about sometimes there are clear examples where there are indigenous peoples and there are no other interests. Here, Baka have lived with their neighbours, what we call Bantu, for hundreds, perhaps 1,000 years. Well, not particularly here, but in Cameroon in general, or in the Congo Basin in general. And if you speak to, when I've spoken to Baka about the idea of land ownership, I think the idea of exclusive land ownership to many Baka is just ludicrous. The idea that someone could come in and say, no, this is my land, only I can use it, everyone else must get out, which is effectively what the government and conservationists are doing, is just an absurd idea. You know, they say that the forest is abundant, there's enough for everyone, provided that it's all properly distributed. And so I don't think, this is just my personal belief, I don't think that Baka would want to see, would want this kind of exclusive control over, or exclusive ownership of the land. I think that they do depend on their neighbours, and there's lots of solidarity and close relationships with their neighbours. So I'm not sure how that could be worked out in the land title, but I think that is quite far down the line. You know, in the meantime, conservationists really do need to respect their occupation and use of this land, and respect their sovereignty, perhaps in a more general way. If that answers your question. But yeah, it's very complicated.
It's a good question. Can we have one more before we break for lunch?
And just about this example, because the problem in other parts, other pygmy groups, was that when they were given title lands, they were forced to settle. So,
yeah.
What was that?
So, and with other pygmy groups in different parts of Africa, when they were given land, like protected space, they were also forced to settle. To kind of like, you have to live in a village, you have to have a school, which these guys might not want.
So I guess that's what the attempts to secure land rights have consisted of until now, mostly in Cameroon, with often missionaries buying up an area and then giving it to Baka. And that is good in many ways, but like you say, has a lot of unintended consequences. So I think it would be important that any land rights are held in common, collective land rights.
I don't think it's unintended. I think they purposely do it so that they settle.
Sedentary.
You
You can't tax hunters and gatherers. One final comment here. Let's take these two together.
Just to add to the sort of discussion that's been happening, and it's something I've discussed actually with some of your colleagues at Survival with regard to the place where I work, which is among the Manik people of southern Thailand, who are continuing actually to live pretty much primarily as mobile forage or hunter-gatherers in a very small area of forest there. And one of the concerns at the present moment, there really is no actually official policy as regards to the Manik and their rights to the forest. But because I think that there's sort of long-standing understanding amongst the Thai state and amongst local communities of the Manik's sort of right to live in the way that they live in the forest, that it works. And one of the concerns that I expressed to your colleagues, and that I think is a very serious concern, is once you get into the realm of delineating what specific rights are, it creates a situation in which people can be punished, for not following the rules exactly right. And you're talking in a sense, I mean, not to get too anthropological about it, but you're talking, it's like completely different understandings of the nature of the world and what a right is. Exactly.
And I think this is like, in some sense, the contradiction and the tension, and actually what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, what's happening with WWF, and this is much bigger issues in terms of forestry concessions, but the central tension of what is the actual solution is, I don't think we actually know. Right? I mean, I don't think it is one that's particularly can be transformed into a policy as we understand policy per se.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. We're going to be talking about access to justice after lunch. Just in front of you, the lady's had her hand up for a long time.
I want to say something.
Sorry. I'm sorry to know your name.
Lee. Hi, thanks. If it's a bit morbid to say I enjoyed your talk, but I really did enjoy the talk. A question that you asked, you mentioned a change in the health practices of the Baka people. You mentioned a rise in things like malaria, HIV/AIDS as well being introduced into villages, and then like a change in the health-seeking practices, or the way in which women feel that they can recover after illnesses, they treat their young and things like this. I want to know, these are obviously now very, very marginalized people, in fact subjugated, and not only how this has impacted their quality of life, but actually the mobility of the villages, of the population, how now these sort of made them fear, or the inability to use the forest to not just to live and to eat, but also to heal themselves, has affected sort of eating, or how you may project that it might in time.
Yeah, of course, two really good points. Just quickly, what Daniel was talking about, that is, really, really crucial. This idea of binding obligations is something which I think we were quite concerned about with this MOU that was drafted, which was written by WWF and another organisation without any consultation with BACA, really. And, had these conditions like they had to report on illegal activities they found, they had to only use environmentally friendly techniques, traditional techniques. So that is a really important thing to bear in mind. And then, so in terms of people's health, I don't think it's been well studied, the impact of all this on Baka health. But just in terms of what people say, people do report a huge decline in life expectancy. People say, we used to have so many old people in our village, now we have none. And some Baka do make explicit link between alcoholism, which is a huge, huge problem. Some people say that maybe every Baka adult is addicted to alcohol in some way. And some make the explicit link. There's one guy said to me, we're forced from the forest, we have nothing to do. What else is there to do apart from drink? So that's a huge, huge public health problem. And then, the things which I was saying before, the lack of medicines with no, lack of kind of allopathic care with nothing to replace it.
The level of stress on those people's faces is very clear.
Yeah. And then other things like the first reported suicide in living history in this region is, 2 years ago.
Well, we'll be talking about rights. Arati, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, it's quite a lot. Well, I mean, the question is there financial? What's the benefit of conservation? Is there some financial motive, I'm missing? Well, because you can see in poaching, people are making money because the authorities are involved and implicit in the abuse of the people. Is there some benefit to the government of the conservation?
So occasionally, conservation is presented as a condition of loans, for example. So there was the Tropical Forest Action Plan in the 1990s in Cameroon, which part of it, like I said, was a commercial rate loan to stimulate logging as a kind of short-term fix, foreign currency infusion. And then that was dependent on the government accepting these grants for the setting up of these national parks. So sometimes it's kind of linked to financial incentives.
But that's because I was asking that because that's one level of the kind of authority being the perpetrators of abuse. But I think the public understanding is really, really important too, because you see, I was in a village on the border of Gabon, and this alcoholism problem you're talking about, there was, everywhere you look on the floor, there are little plastic sachets. And they, and some of them will say things like Johnny Stalker, they're like knockoff.
Yeah, or land on gin.
Yeah, and the women wake up in the morning and the villagers were like, they're dérangés, and people are crazy because all of them are alcoholic. But there was some people from North Cameroon who were in a little school that was opened by the Americans, and they were saying, these people are lazy. Why do they go into the forest? Look at the land so fertile, why don't they grow their own vegetables? And they don't even understand the people they're living with.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, because in India there's a hugely fractionated society and the caste system and all of this. And what I find is, I know in that village there was no water or electricity, but in India, even in the forest, people have satellite dishes, and so a lot of public messages are going out so they'll have dramas on TV where they'll portray different rungs of society, and you get, through the drama, people change. I've seen people change behavior because they've bonded with a character. And I wonder if you have friends in, I don't know, someone in the country, someone who can make these public messages that might influence how their own people think about their neighbors.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, something that's just hard to know where to begin. I mean, there's not the same kind of infrastructure of information, I think, here, a kind of public message. Occasionally messages are announced on the radio, but they're not really listened to. But it is true, there's a huge, I don't know if it can be described as a caste system, a system of inequality, in some cases mutually beneficial for the Baka, for the Pygmies and their neighbors, but in other cases, I think, in fact, can be considered slavery. So not on the whole, but there are some Bantu individuals who cultivate alcoholism in Baka, and Baka choose to work on their fields in exchange for nothing but alcohol, these sachets or local moonshine. And
so I think in the name of progress, they're trying to invalidate those cultures, their indigenous cultures, the
yeah.
way they live and the way they hunt. And it's not easy for them to walk for 6 hours in the forest and not a single trap and any meat in it. So on all sides they're being...
Yeah, and there's the same kind of response I've come across in Cameroon, where their neighbours, not even people from the north, but people they've lived with, hundreds of years, saying, "Oh, Baka are stupid, they're childlike, they need to be taught the difference between right and wrong." And really, it's sometimes benevolent, but sometimes quite malicious racism on the part of local people, and going right up to the government. Like we said, there's a really deep-seated racism about hunter-gatherers and nomadic or semi-nomadic way of life. People think that it's backwards, it needs to be stamped out, that the forest is just for animals, just for people. So changing these kinds of prejudices is perhaps the most crucial thing, but hard to know exactly where to begin. I think for the moment, it's perhaps more straightforward to focus on accountability. Who is providing the money for crimes that are going on, and how can they be held to account?
Well, on that note, let us feel blessed for having lunch. Really. Freddie, thank you very much.
Thank you.